try and cover 3 different ideas that we've seen working with different engineering, product, and quality leaders that hopefully will be useful for you to take away with today. So let's get started. So before I jump into all of the content and what we go through, 30-second overview about how we actually got to this position that we are in now. So I mentioned this maybe in my quick 60-second pitch at the start of the day, but less than 10 years ago, we were running a VC-backed company that was in the fashion and beauty industry at the time. And when we were running that company, one of the biggest challenges that we had was around testing and having a quality-led approach to the products that we were building. All the time, we were met with device-related issues, compatibility issues. We were launching into new markets and weren't getting the level of coverage that we needed to be able to scale our testing approach and solution. And so what we decided to do is just pivot the company entirely from beauty all the way through to testing, which sounds crazy, and it was at the time. It still kind of feels like it is as well. So fast forward to where we are now with global app testing, one of the fastest growing crowdsourced testing companies in the world. We now work with a range of different clients, helping them with their quality strategy and approach to augment their testing resources so that they can scale to meet the level of market demand, to tackle challenges around release bottlenecks, speeding up their testing, and internationalizing their approach. And through that, we're powered by this network, an amazing group of around 80,000 professional testers all around the world. This was at a recent event that we organized. We organized these events called testathons. Anyone have ever heard of a hackathon before? Yeah, quite a few people, great. So we basically run hackathons, but for testers. They join, they win some cool prizes, they network, they meet. And it's a great way for us to meet the creme de la creme in our community and invite them onto our testing cycles. And all of that is powered by this incredible team, our internal team, who are just hell-bent on supporting our customers, developing world-class products. And of course, from that and over the past 10 years, we've worked with some incredible clients as well, from the likes of BBC, Meta, and Google, Atlassian, and a number of others too. And from working with a number of these amazing customers, we've then had the chance to be up close with individual leaders, and incredible leaders in terms of the way they think about quality. And we've kind of got a sneak peek view on what works and what doesn't work inside a number of these companies right now, which hopefully we're going to share some of those ideas with you guys today. And from doing that and from meeting a lot of these leaders and working with them, we then decided to distill a lot of these learnings and interviews and conversations into a book. And we've got the book outside in the Skyview suite that we're more than happy to share with all of you guys today. It then became an Amazon bestseller, which is pretty cool. And we've kind of distilled all these lessons down around how people think about quality culture and strategy and thinking. And we got so many of these questions, we just felt that it was more useful to be packaged up in a book that we can give to people so that they can think through these things as well. And that's got some great reviews from logos that hopefully you can see and hear across that, which has been great to see in the industry. That's led to the challenge, or the selfish challenge for me, which is I've got to now distill in 18 minutes key groups of learnings of those. So I've tried to pick 3 different things that will hopefully be useful to you, that you could take away, and hopefully you can take away at least one idea, at least one, and share that with your teams as you go back and say, I attended that talk on the testing track by Fahim, and this was a really great idea. Hopefully you take away all 3, but I'll take one if you can go to that. Cool, so let's go through our ideas and what we're gonna go through. So idea number 1 is how we create a culture of quality that supports our growth strategy. Number 2 is about creating stories that influence and persuade. And idea number 3 is about how do we show the value of our work that aligns with business outcomes and business goals. So let's go back to and start with idea number 1, which is how we create a culture of quality that supports growth. And when we think about that phrasing, culture of quality, I don't know about anyone in this room, but certainly when I started speaking and discussing topics around culture, it always seemed a bit like a fluffy term for me. It was very difficult to define and understand and work through. And so when we had a lot of these conversations with a number of these different leaders, they had kind of rephrased this topic, or helped us and myself think through this, and rebranded that as a quality narrative. So the quality narrative is just the story that we tell ourselves that exists in our company about how people think about quality, whether we have a high quality product, whether it's a low quality product. How do people think about and talk about quality when we're not around? And when we think about the narrative, there are really and typically 4 common narratives that we see exist at a number of the companies that we've worked with over the years. So the first is to do with internal versus the external narrative. So the internal narrative, and again, from some of these narratives, you may see this exist within your own companies today. The internal narrative is when an internal team, the product or the engineering team, look at the product from an internal lens, as it says there, internal. And what we mean by an internal lens is they look at things from how the product has been developed. And they talk, in a praiseworthy way about the way the product has been designed and developed and using the most up-to-date development practices, which are all incredibly important, but they don't take into account the end customer view. They don't take into account the external view, which is looking at things from a customer lens. And when we think about the external lens and the customer view, I'm really referring to things that pulling from the likes of Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, where Jeff Bezos in his letter to shareholders, he always talks about customers being divinely discontent. And what we see is a lot of these incredible business leaders have this maniacal focus on customer obsession, because they know that at the end of the day, it's the customer who is helping them grow their business and driving success. So really about trying to reframe our thinking into the eyes of the customer with that customer lens. Narrative number 2, the ownership narrative. So depending on wherever you are in your company right now, there is a way that quality is thought about. And with the ownership narrative, this is a view that everyone in the company should take a level of ownership of quality. They should see it as their responsibility throughout the company. An example would be HubSpot. It's a multi-million-dollar company in the marketing automation and CRM space, and went and IPO'd a few years ago. And the CPO at the time, David Cancel, what he said was that he decided in order to have this ownership narrative throughout his company, he would pair various members of different teams together in a cross-functional manner. So for example, he would pair the customer support reps with the senior engineers and developers and designers. And that way, by pairing these cross-functional members together, what he found was that the customer support reps started to develop a mindset where they had understood what should go into a support ticket report, in a support ticket issue that would actually be valuable for the engineering team to action upon and prioritize. What is the metadata that they should be taking and asking so that that support ticket can actually be prioritized and actioned in their Jira backlog or similar. And so by taking that narrative, they then had everyone have this ownership view on quality is my responsibility and something that I can look after. So narrative number 3, this is the one that is probably the most spoken about, the how to test narrative. The how to test narrative is the sum of all the strategies, tactics, techniques, vendor solutions that a company uses when they talk about testing. And we hear this all the time about how companies think about testing and they carry out their testing and breathe, live, and eat when it comes to testing. And with the how to test narrative, we find that there's typically 2 different challenges because it can go wrong. And the first is there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all type solution. There is no silver bullet, and there is no one solution or vendor. Even if you speak to 1,000,001 vendors, even if you speak to global app testing, we're not going to be the one solution that you need to design the best test approach for your company. And it's about having a multitude of different approaches and a blend of different solutions, automation, manual, regression, non-functional, that's going to allow you to reach the best outcomes. The second is something that we all probably have a tendency to do, because this essentially means that we need to take a first principles and original thinking view on everything. But sometimes we don't like to do that. We like to be a little bit lazy and like to copy things that we've seen has been successful. And this is copying without context. Has anyone come across the Spotify model before of squads, chapters, guilds? A few people? Okay, great. So Spotify have this model about how they design their engineering organization so that it's a more cross-functional environment. It means they can release faster. It means they've led to them accelerating velocity by organizing teams in squads, chapters, and guilds. I highly encourage anyone to research a little bit more about that after. And what a lot of teams have done is they just basically copied that model and said, it's working for Spotify, let's apply that to our team. And actually what we found is that many teams actually did the opposite. They slowed their approach. They became more siloed. There was a lack of direction, a lack of vision, a lack of who's reporting to who. And so that led to teams actually not getting the outcomes that they wanted. So copying just for the sake of copying didn't lead to the outcome that they wanted. It's really important that we understand those end outcomes. And the final narrative is the value narrative. Now, this is the least spoken about, but probably the most important. And whenever we speak to a lot of testing teams, they actually start from a point when they're implementing a new idea or a new approach. They're speaking about it from a place of risk and mitigating risk as much as possible. Some of those teams may go a layer deeper and speak about the savings in terms of man hours that would be saved from taking up that idea or approach. And hardly any team would speak about the potential for revenue generation or revenue opportunity from taking up that new idea. And that ends up being a massive gap, because what happens is that teams miss out on being able to communicate things in a way that other stakeholders, business-minded stakeholders, would be able to understand. And so instead of this risk, savings, revenue approach, what we want to do is you want to flip that script entirely and flip that model so that we're actually speaking about the revenue opportunity in generation. We then speak about the savings that can occur, as well as incorporating risk. Now, this doesn't change how we're communicating and talking right now. This is just emphasizing different parts of the work we're doing while bringing up other or additional areas to what we're already saying. So that's idea number one. A quick pit stop around idea number one. Because of time, I'd love to go into these in more depth, but hopefully we can do that on a one-to-one basis at the stand. So idea number one. Idea number two, creating stories that influence and persuade. And when it comes to influencing and persuading and even selling, that can be a bit of a dirty word at times. And actually, we spend so much of our day selling, whether it's to partners, kids, our pets, all the time. So when we think about creating influence or creating stories, we actually need to improve and get better at telling much more effective stories via storytelling methods. And this is challenging, right? This is difficult. This is not something that we can just pick up and read a book and tell better stories. So when it comes to telling better stories, one area that we had come across, or at least an idea, was around the epiphany bridge. And so with an epiphany bridge, and this is something that we'd researched and looked at and been able to tell better stories. And to tell kind of a very short personal story for me, I used to find it really difficult to get my ideas across. And I thought they were pretty good ideas, but I found it difficult for people to take up those ideas and to be able to understand what I was trying to say and have those ideas implemented. And it kind of frustrated me. And it was something that I wanted to get much, much better at. And so what I did is I then looked at and researched an idea around this thing called an epiphany bridge, and it helped me to tell much more effective and better stories, which then led to more of my ideas being implemented and more people taking me up on those ideas. What I've just done is I've just done an epiphany bridge about an epiphany bridge. And so what I would have done before doing the epiphany bridge is I would have said, hey, Ben, this is a really great idea called an epiphany bridge. It helped me tell better stories. You should research and look into it. But the problem with that approach, or the previous approach, was I'm not meeting you where you are right now. I'm only meeting you where I am, which is after I've already met this great revelation. But I've not met you where you were, which is that you haven't even come across this revelation yet. So in a nutshell, the epiphany bridge is when you start at one point in time, which is before you know about it, and the next part is after you know about it. So being able to explain the before and then the transition to turn into after and the benefits of that is incredibly powerful. Now, let's apply this to a testing context. So from a testing context, there are two questions that we had as we were building global app testing that we would continually come across from a lot of our customers. And this was something that we ourselves wanted to have a really in-depth understanding over. And that is, can we automate everything? And should we automate everything? So we ended up sitting down with one of our friends who's the head of quality called Dan Ashby. If you don't know Dan Ashby, you should definitely check out a lot of his stuff. He writes a ton about testing and QA and leadership and a bunch of other stuff. And what he did is he sat us down, he got his iPad out, and he got his very smart pen on his iPad, and he drew a box. And in that box, he put information. And he said that as quality professionals, we are trying to get better information because better information leads to better decisions. And then he creates another box called investigating. And he said that one type of activity that we would do to get information is we would do investigative style activities. So that's very much in the discovery and exploratory type of work. And by doing that type of work, we then uncover new information. And the information we get helps guide the future investigative activities that we would be doing. He then drew box number 3, which he put verifying. And he'd say that this is another type of activity, which is verifying style activities. And verifying activities or checking activities, in this case, it might be test automation or specific test scripts, would create certain expectations about how a product has been built. And on top of that, it also provides new information for us to make better decisions. And so that helped us articulate from doing verifying and investigative activities, it helped us realize that can we automate, which is actually you can automate a number of the verifying style activities. But at this stage, at least until AI catches up, nothing can really replace the human creativity and intelligence and curiosity from the investigative style activities right now. So question number 2, should we automate everything? So we then zoom in on our verifying box. And what he did is he drew a line in the middle, and then he drew a person on one side, and he drew some zeros and ones on the other side. And what he said was that there are going to be some activities that are great for a human to carry out, and there are other activities or verifying activities which are great and important for a machine to carry out. Now, that's going to depend on product maturity and team maturity and a number of other areas. But this still left us with a bit of a black box to uncover, okay, well, how do we know what should be done by a person and what should be done by a machine? And so we came across this study by IBM. It's called the Cost of IT Operations, and we can share it if anyone's interested after. And really summarizing this and distilling it, there were 3 factors to determine whether something should be automated or not. The first was around time, the length of time it takes for a test to run. The second was ease. How easy is it to automate? If it's an application that's continually changing and becoming a lot less stable, then it's less likely to be applicable for checking that automation box. And the third and final thing was around cost. If it's more effective and cost effective to automate and to be a better candidate for that, then that's something that should be taken up. So instead of, the way that we went through that epiphany bridge was, instead of it becoming a automation versus manual conversation for us, this led to us thinking this should be a collaboration and a blend between how automation and manual testing should actually work together. Not just automation and manual, but a whole host and range of other solutions to help us reach better outcomes. So that's the benefit that we came across by going through this process when it comes to the Epiphany Bridge, and we can talk more about how other impactful areas of our time with the Epiphany Bridge had led to what we did. But if you wanted to learn more about how to influence or persuade, here are some books. And again, we can share the presentation, or feel free to take a picture of that. My personal favorite is To Sell Is Human by Daniel Pink. And there's this one quote or phrase where he said that 40% of our day is spent selling. And again, that's depending on who you're speaking to. It doesn't have to be, and most likely to be, an outside of work endeavor as well, like I was saying, with a partner, a family member, relationships, people at the grocery store or similar. So it's really good continuous learning options to be had there. So that's idea number 2 around creating stories that influence and persuade. So stick with me for the final idea. So idea number 3, this is how we show the value of our work so that everyone else in the business understands and has the right aligned outcomes to what we're trying to achieve so we can reach our goals. And so when we were thinking about this idea number 3 on showing the value of our work, and spoke to many people and asked them, how do you communicate to the business the value that you're actually providing? They provided a range of different answers and research papers and questions for us to think about. And we really distilled this down into 3 different questions. So question number 1 was what metrics actually matter the most to the business. To global app testing, for example, it's going to be different to JLR or to Canon Europe or to Facebook, for example. So what metrics are going to matter the most? There's going to be some underlying similar themes around, number of customers, revenue, etc. But there's probably some more unique metrics around that too. The second is what metrics does the QA team focus on? And we've heard everything from the number of bugs found to the mean time to discover and mean time to fix an issue, to crash-free rate or similar. And the third is what does the business care about that QA and the QA team's activities or the quality team's activities can actually affect. And one of the consistent themes through this was this idea of a growth metric. And you might be thinking, okay, well, what is a growth metric? You've mentioned this phrase. Well, the growth metric essentially is the one metric to rule them all. Well, kind of. But essentially, it's that one metric that has the greatest impact on growth in the company, and it's the one that the customer themselves actually value the most. So what do we mean by that? So I'm going to talk through 3 hyper quick examples around growth metrics that span from attention, transaction, and productivity. So let's go through an example for attention. So media companies, social media companies, a lot of consumer-facing companies are going to have similar metrics. And we all probably watch far too much Netflix already, but Netflix would likely be the most amount of valued hours spent on Netflix. Twitter and others have daily active users, monthly active users. I'm sure even at your own companies, even if you work in the B2B space, or if you're a back-end application that integrates with SAP, a level of engagement is probably going to be an area of a metric, even if it's not your absolute #1 core growth metric there. So daily active users and attention spent on that application is going to be the most important for a number of these types of companies here. The second is transaction. So on a transaction metric, we think about Airbnb. And I'm sure many of us have spent time on booking.com or being able to book, on a night on Airbnb. And they're really trying to optimize for the number of nights booked on Airbnb. They want to increase that number month on month, year on year. And they want to increase the value per night booked over a certain time frame as well. So for them, it is about the amount of transaction. You'll find this really common within e-commerce or retail type companies. And the final area is productivity-based metric. So a good example of that is Slack. So Slack, from all their data analysis and analytics, had figured out that if they were able to have a team from day 1 to about day 21, send about 2,000 messages, they are 92% more likely to stick around and be a valuable customer for Slack if they're able to send that many messages. So this can go for a chat or a social-based application, but most likely we see this play out quite a lot in the B2B space as well. It might be a different metric as opposed to messaging or something similar. For global app testing, for example, our metric would be the number of tests run per day or per night or per month or per year. If we see that number increasing, then that is a number that, or at least something that we are proud of as a company, that we're centering around and increasing that goal, which is likely to be a transaction-based metric too. Cool. So even where you are right now, you might even be thinking, what might your own team's metric or growth metric be? And not even just thinking about the growth metric and leaving it, but think about that growth metric as well as what are the engineering and quality teams' activities doing to influence that metric? How's the work that your team is doing feeding into improving that metric or moving the needle and moving the dial? An example that maybe in the UK will likely be familiar with is USwitch. And so I remember for the book and for the research that we were doing, we spoke to now ex-CTO at USwitch before he started at USwitch. He was telling us about before he started at USwitch, where the team were misaligned about what the growth metric was. Revenue was down, morale was down. They themselves didn't know where they were trying to focus on, and they were focusing more on process than they were on outcome, which led to kind of the team not being in an aligned in a good place. And he came in and he said, well, what is the business focusing on? What is the growth metric that we're aligned on and centering around? And he got the entire team in kind of a brainstorming room, and they'd decided what their growth metric was, which is the number of switches. So based on the number of switches, if they find that more people are switching per day, per week, per night, per month and beyond, then their business will grow. So for them, it was a hard change to say, this is the one metric that we're doing. And then what they started doing after that, and it was challenging, is they had to question all their activities and say, is this making our metric grow? Is this leading to more switches coming across? And that was the key metric that they had, which then led to them 5xing their business, improving revenue, improving the alignment within the teams. So having that core metric and knowing the activities that feed into that objective and metric is incredibly important for anyone. So that's idea number 3 on how we show the value of our work by tying things back to objectives and to metrics that matter to that objective. So let's go through our takeaways around what we've just learned and gone through in this rapid fire talk. So number 1, understand what your company's quality narrative is. Number 2, grow your level of influence and persuasion abilities and skills. And one of the ways we do that is by applying the skills that we've just gone through around the epiphany bridge stories. And finally, understand your growth metric and the activities that support your growth metric as well. This is a good slide to take a photo of. This kind of captures everything that we've just gone through. Let's wait for the photos to be done. I think they are. Cool, perfect. Awesome. And so I'd like to leave you with just kind of a higher kind of holistic message around, no matter where you are, if you're someone who's got 20 years of experience to someone who's just started yesterday and you've got day 2 at this conference, which is pretty cool if that is the case. But you can influence change. You can influence change. You can be a leader of quality in your organization. You can adopt the right narrative, whether it be an ownership narrative to the value narrative. You can get your teams aligned on the right processes and objectives so that the team itself are focused on the things that actually matter. And so as a thank you for listening to my talk over the last, I think, 24 minutes, however long I've gone on for, we wanted to give you guys a copy of the Leading Quality book. You can get a physical copy outside as well, so please go ahead and do that. But if you want it digital, if that's your preference, or even audio, then feel free to take a screenshot of that or take a photo of that so you can get a digital copy. We can also send it to you after as well. And I'll come back to this slide in just a second. But yeah, just thanks a lot. Again, if you wanted to meet us, then please come through to the Skyview suites and we can share more about global app testing, some of the messages that I've gone through today, and we can talk more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
No worries.
Time for a few questions. Otherwise, very interesting. I noticed one of your customers is actually speaking later on. We have TripAdvisor. So
Yeah, excited for that talk later. Yeah, absolutely.
excellent. So do we have questions?
Loads of times. Yeah, absolutely. Because with the Epiphany Bridge, we're speaking about the before and the after. And I think we also, at times, that helps people understand if they're in that before stage to know and be educated to get to that after stage. But if they're not even at the before stage, if they're not really being able to articulate exactly where they are in that journey, and they're kind of in that, I don't know what I don't know stage, I'm still not sure whether this is valuable, even sharing that Epiphany Bridge answer may not be as valuable because they're not at that stage to be able to then say, this is where I am now, and this is where I could be. So I think it's about knowing where people are to hear that type of story. And maybe it might be a different type of message or proposition that would be more valuable than just going through Epiphany Bridge answer. But yeah, I've definitely bombed a number of times when trying to go through that message, and some people are like, but I'm not even there yet. I can't even understand why it's even valuable. And then we need to take things back even further. And typically it's not just about, trying to influence and persuade and trying to just share the message. Sometimes it's about just understanding where they are right now, which is asking effective questions. And if you can just ask people questions, then typically that can help them uncover things because they already know the answers. So helping them figure out the answer by just asking questions can be a really effective coaching technique, which I found to be actually even more impactful at times than just trying to share a story about something. Yeah.
Please, can you scroll back to the 4 books on influence and persuasion?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I know I can get the slides later.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really good,
I've read any of those, so that's
all really,
something to do.
yeah, really powerful books across that. I think the first one is like the foundation of learning about persuasion and influence by Robert Cialdini. I think with this one, I'll be honest, I don't remember the majority, but the title is so great. The title is so great. I just had to include it in there.
I mean, let me share it because I think I've always thought this storytelling is overdone. The BBC have somebody in charge of making sure every program talks about stories all the time.
Yeah.
And I felt it was overdone. I went to Test Bash conference a few weeks ago, and there was a guy who gave what I thought was the most convincing one. But like you, I think I've got brilliant ideas, and I can't understand why people don't understand.
Yeah, and sometimes I have to question: is it because the idea is just bad? But
No,
that's
I think it's because I'm not persuading them.
yeah.
For sure. I was talking to Dan Ashby just there as well.
Yeah.
We share opinions.
And I find that folks, anyway, in any case, in the engineering and quality field, actually have a really strong, nuanced understanding of how to build or to share a really great solution. But the gap that's missing is the way it's communicated. And if we can bridge that gap, that can make such a difference to a company's trajectory or even someone's life. So it's really important that we all can cultivate and grow these skills.
Storytelling is a really good way of sharing knowledge. Dave Snowden, who spoke this morning, for many years, like 30 years ago, we've been around a long time, UNICOM used to run a lot of events around knowledge management. It's an area we come back to. And storytelling is such a great way, particularly big organizations, of sharing knowledge and information.
Absolutely.
I think about 20 years ago, there was a big fashion around storytelling workshops. And we ran a lot actually with Dave, and it kind of went out of fashion. But we're seeing it coming back now.
Yeah. I also recommend looking at, yeah, absolutely. I was looking at Pixar's 22 rules of storytelling. I'm not going to get this right, but there's one aspect of the 22 rules, and it was something like, once upon a time, this happens from where, someone's life was normal. Then some events happened and their life changed. Then this happened. Then they were met with this obstacle. And they overcame the obstacle. And then this is their new life. And that whole storytelling